Great. So I think
we will get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today, wherever you are in the world. Before we begin, I will just say that live closed captioning is available. So please use that if you need to. I will also point out that the webinar will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel in the next week or so. My name is Jessica. I am the front of house and marketing supervisor here at Benjamin Franklin House, and I am thrilled to introduce our speaker, Alice Hopkinson, here today. Alice is our graduate researcher in residence, and you might have caught a fantastic talk she did with us for Thanksgiving back in November. So we are very excited to welcome her back today. She's also a recent graduate from an MA in Cultural History at the University of Chichester, and she actually took a particular interest in Benjamin Franklin and Peter Collinson while she was there. So we are in very expert hands. So thank you and welcome, Alice.
Oh, thank you.
So today's lecture is in celebration of Royal Horticultural Society's National Gardening Week, which is running from the 1st to the 7th of May. But you might be asking, what relevance does this have to Benjamin Franklin and transatlantic politics? So we are about to find out. There will be a chance for questions at the end, so please do type them into the Q&A box as we go, and we will try to answer them at the end. We're expected to wrap up at around 5:45, so I think it's probably about time we got started. So over to you, Alice. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jessica. It's lovely to be here. It's lovely for everyone to be here as well. I think I'm just going to jump straight into it, to be honest, and share my screen and jump straight into the presentation. So thank you everyone for joining. So Franklin and Collinson, I've taken a particular interest myself in Benjamin Franklin for quite a few years, as Jessica said. I think I took particular interest in him from around my dissertation when I did my undergraduate, and kind of went on from there. I think originally I did the American Enlightenment and the influence of the European Enlightenment on the American Enlightenment and the subsequent American Revolution, and I found that Franklin was quite a pivotal character in this movement. And then that was something that I took on to do in my master's. And in doing research for Benjamin Franklin, one of the things that I found was that he really had a lot of connections, and he was surrounding himself with these amazing minds that were at the forefront of their fields at the time, and he could essentially rely on in terms of like favors or correspondence or just anything really. It was even just if it was just friendship. And Peter Collinson was one of those people, and he cropped up quite a lot in terms of when I was reading texts on Benjamin Franklin. Collinson would come up quite a lot, but often in a sense of his relation to Benjamin Franklin. It was never kind of mentioned in as much detail as perhaps I would have wanted to see. They never really discussed much about him, his life, and a lot of the literature just kind of mentioned him in a sense of how he was useful to Franklin, rather than who he was as a person. So that is something that I took great interest in and did my master's on. So when I did my master's, I did it on the relationship between Franklin and Collinson, in relation to both Franklin's position as like a public statesman and his position as a scientist or a natural philosopher, as they would have said at the time. And Peter Collinson falls under that second category. Something I'll come on to much more in who he was and what he did later on, but I think I'm going to go to dive straight into the talk and go on to the main focus. So Collinson was born a few years prior to Franklin in 1694, and much like Franklin, became very successful very quickly. And despite this, I would argue he's not as known or as appreciated as I think he should be. Throughout his life, he maintained this sort of selflessness and was dedicated to committing deeds that would not only benefit him, but also those around him. And he became deeply interested in the American colonies and saw great potential in American academics that at the beginning of the 18th century were beginning to really find their feet and properly establish themselves and settle their own intellectual authority in this evolving world of the 13 colonies prior to any kind of notion of independence or union or anything like that. He advocated quite a lot for his American colleagues, and went to great lengths to see them succeed in their fields, whether it was promoting them directly through himself to the Royal Society, or by furnishing them with like the means to do so themselves, like providing equipment or connections to other people that he thought could advance their own career. And it was this interest and this advocacy that he had in his colleagues and the people around him that really secured his fame and his position in the evolving world of the Enlightenment, and is something I will go into greater detail on later. But for now, I'm going to turn back to Collinson and talk about sort of who he really was to begin with. So who was Peter Collinson? He can probably, I would say, best be summed up in 3 terms: as a merchant, as a botanist, and as an avid intellectual. As a merchant, as many people were, it was quite a popular trade and quite a popular career. He inherited his business from his father and dealt mainly with the American colonies. And as a result, he was very familiar with trade routes. He acquired an extensive list of international correspondence ranging from captains to other merchants, dignitaries, political figures, academic figures, anyone who was at any point in time associated with any kind of trade. Collinson could have potentially known them and most likely would have known them. And it's the latter of that group of people, so these intellectual and academic figures, that will be the kind of main focus of attention here in terms of who he interacted with and who he spoke to. Above all, and something that really benefited him as a result of being a merchant, aside from his connections and knowledge of trade routes and like practical applications of the business, it earned him a great deal of money because he was a very successful merchant. His father had a very successful business, and in turn he was able to apply his knowledge and really sort of bolster his business when he took it under his control. So this success financially meant he was able to really fund what was quite, in reality, quite an expensive hobby, which was his botany and his gardening. So he wasn't really content with living the life of just a merchant. As a person, he always wanted to know more. He had quite a strong thirst for knowledge, something he did share with Franklin, and had quite a strong academic ambition, and was gifted both academically and socially. So the gardening aspect of Collinson, as I will discuss, interested him from quite an early age. He chose this to be his field of interest, and through his connection as a merchant, was in regular contact with a large number of people that were working in and actively producing academic work for that field. And as such, it was this kind of combination and sort of intersection of his career and his passion that led him to become quite an accomplished botanist. And it's here that at this point that he realizes as well that he can exploit this connection both for his own personal ambition and for that of those around him. So he sees that there's this potential in the business of importing and exporting plants, and can essentially kill 2 birds with 1 stone by facilitating the exchange of plant specimens and seeds and all sorts of like flora, and study them both for his own personal and academic gain in order to kind of satiate that innate thirst for knowledge that he had, but also to advance the careers of those around him and expand as a result his own network of correspondence. So looking into greater detail at Collinson's work as a botanist, his passion for planting, excuse the pun, there will be many, came from his early youth. So he grew up with a garden. He grew up in Peckham and took great care of this garden, put a lot of effort into it. He curated it and put so much attention into it. And it ended up attracting a lot of local and public attention for how well maintained and how beautiful it was. He went to great lengths to seek out interesting and exotic plants for his garden, and these were statement pieces, if you will. And he was meticulous in his organization and cataloging of his garden. And it's at this point that you can see it's clearly going far beyond a sort of mere hobby. In later life, he inherited his Mill Hill property from his wife's family in 1749, and this garden would become his essentially pride and joy. And in this garden, he'd incorporate a vast number of exotic plants, trees, shrubs, and many of these he'd introduced into the country himself through his American connections. And as it moved from a mere hobby into something more in-depth and more serious, this is where we see Collinson really come into his own and apply the knowledge of his profession and his skills as a merchant. So the key to his success was really how well he was able to apply his profession to his hobby. So initially, prior to any sort of involvement with the Royal Society or any correspondence he maintained with his American colleagues, he did heavily rely on these trade connections that he had to acquire specimens for him. He was able to finance his interests, as I mentioned, due to his successes as a merchant, but mainly relied on sort of the goodwill of others to procure his specimens for him. So in exchange for maybe like a favourable trade, he would ask certain merchants if they were going to the West Indies or to the sort of fledgling American colonies, would ask them to sort of seek out anything that may be of interest and bring it back to him for study. And then in turn, he'd grow and cultivate these in his own private garden or send them off for study to his other colleagues in the botanical field. And then as a result, kind of facilitate this growing network of correspondence for botany that he had. And as his correspondence network grew, especially as he began working with the American colleagues, which is something that I will go into detail on in a second, he began to rely on them more to send over his specimens. Now, Collinson wasn't the first person to take an interest in botany as kind of his side interest, but he was one of the first and perhaps the most successful to apply this knowledge of his business and trade in order to ease and become more successful in the exchange of knowledge and of sharing specimens across the Atlantic. Now, I mentioned that he spoke regularly to academics, and his prominence as a merchant meant he was in regular contact with them, and they often reached out for requests. Now, Collinson's private garden, as I mentioned, both at Peckham and later at Mill Hill, had already gained him a great deal of notoriety in the academic field and the world of botany, and the collection was studied by many of his contemporaries. He became able to add these like colleagues and later friends to his seemingly ever-growing list of correspondence. Quite early on, he became very well acquainted with members of the Royal Society, which was the most eminent institution, learned institution of the age, especially in the world of like the evolving European Enlightenment. And he became really quite familiar with some of the big names, such as Hans Sloane, who was the president after Newton, and he was later admitted into the Royal Society in 1728 at the age of 34 and became quite quickly a very active member. He was publishing regularly for them and became the middleman for the exchange of specimens, and quickly realized he could do a great deal with this, both for himself personally, for his own botanical kind of interests, and from the standpoint of a merchant. So not only could he fund this venture himself, he could very quickly profit, but also become quite an eminent name by keeping a lot of these specimens for himself and by reaching out and sort of seeking out favourable exchanges. So I mentioned the Royal Society. In 1729, so the year after he became a member. He published his first paper in the Philosophical Transactions, which was the kind of the newsletter, if you will, of the Royal Society. And in 1732, he was promoted to council. So 3 years after he was elected as a member, he very quickly rose up to a position of kind of eminence and importance. And all while this is going on, Collinson's still interweaving his career and his pastime, and continues to facilitate the exchange of specimens and using his status to introduce others to the Royal Society as well, and to expand his own network in the process. So he had something of a you scratch my back, I scratch yours kind of approach, to put it sort of simply. He would approach those in the field of botany and gardening with the prospect of giving them a kind of a foot in the door for the Royal Society, and in return request specimens to be sent to him for his own personal collection and appraisal. So by 1736, so 8 years, I had to do the maths quickly, 8 years after he was accepted as a name and a figure in the botanical community, after 8 years after he was accepted into the Royal Society, he'd become one of the most sort of prominent names in the field of botany, and was responsible for introducing many American species of plants into Britain, and for facilitating the acquisition and cataloguing or classification of many more. So examples of a few kind of plants that Collinson introduced might look familiar. So from here we have the fringe tree, we have moss phlox, mountain laurel, the American cowslip, and an honourable mention does go to the Venus flytrap. Now, Collinson didn't actually introduce this one himself. He was simply the first description of a Venus flytrap for a European audience was sent to Collinson in a letter in 1759, which kind of, aside from the other four, which demonstrate his kind of impact in introducing what we now see as kind of familiar plants into British gardening culture, it also shows how he was facilitating this network of correspondence that went between the colonies of America, where the Venus flytrap is native to European shores and European audiences. So one key element that I've mentioned and omitted from Collinson's botanical career so far is talking about the details of his relationship with the American colleagues that I've mentioned thus far, with one of the most important of these being John Bartram. Bartram was a farmer turned botanist, similar to how Collinson began. So he was largely self-taught. He took up gardening and botany as more of a hobby, but is now recognized as one of the finest botanists of his generation, and was even lauded as such by his contemporaries. He very quickly in America caught the attention of James Logan, who was one of the most influential men in the colonies, and tutored Bartram on botany. He allowed him to use his library, and only let a select few others do that, and one of which was Benjamin Franklin. So Logan to these men, they would later become themselves in later life. Logan was respected so deeply amongst the American colonists and the learned society in America, and was such an eminent name that it was quite the honor to kind of be allowed access to this and to be tutored by him, because in a sense it was an appreciation that Logan saw potential in these men and was willing to tutor them to become to reach the same kind of academic prowess that he had reached himself. Bartram was put in contact with Collinson through mutual connections in their social circles, and this being another example of Collinson's network in action. Despite the fact that the two never met in real life, it was clear that his social circle and his correspondence network stretched so far to reach even kind of some farmer in America who up until a certain point had never even kind of broached the prospect of becoming involved in these intellectual circles. The person that put them in contact was someone called Joseph Brightnell, who was the first secretary of the Library Company of Philadelphia, which I will discuss in a later slide. But it was his understanding and his awareness of Collinson's desire to create a plant exchange system with the American colonies that led the two to forge a stream of correspondence that lasted from 1733 until Collinson's death in 1768. Now, as part of this correspondence, Collinson would initially encourage Bartram to send specimens requested both by him and by other clients and connections of Collinson, and forward them on for their own personal use, or were often requested by Collinson himself. Bartram's specialties were the Kalmia, so it was the same genus as the mountain laurel from the previous slide, magnolias, rhododendrons, and azaleas, as these were quite commonly found across sort of the east coast of America and were relatively easy to gain access to. But Collinson had the idea to kind of streamline their exchange and financially profit, both himself and indirectly profit for Bartram. So this is again Collinson applying his business knowledge and his knowledge of trade to the situation. So he offered Bartram a proposition. Bartram would send shipments of plants, cuttings, seeds, specimens, any kind of flora or sometimes even fauna, so like animals that would intrigue him, and anything that could be deemed a sort of intellectual or academic kind of value, and would ship these to Collinson in London. Collinson would then box these up and sell them as plant subscription boxes and sell them to private buyers and then share in the profits. So in return, Collinson would send books for Bartram's education, clothes, and other items that he deemed to be of value to Bartram, but more importantly, lend Bartram his expertise, and again offered him a foot in the door to this kind of amazing world of the European Enlightenment that could offer him so much for his career and could put him in contact with like the best of the best. Now, this was such a groundbreaking idea because up until this point, Collinson and others as well had been requesting plants, and the exchange of plants was ongoing at the time, but it was never something that was consistently funded into the sense that it was like a process. It wasn't, there was no kind of regularity behind it. Whereas this subscription box meant there was like an increased demand and a constant demand for plants that would always be ongoing across the Atlantic. And they became immensely popular amongst the British public quite quickly. So they set trends for gardening and were lapped up essentially both by private buyers, so people who just wanted to kind of decorate their own garden, but also by more eminent buyers, which I will discuss in a second. So one thing to note at this point in time is that gardens in general were quite, not mundane, but they were quite uniform. They mainly focused around topiary and hedges, nothing too extreme or outlandish. The occasional pop of colour, but nothing too kind of drastic. With the advent of exploration, with the expansion of empire and the opening of new trade routes, this allowed for the expansion of sort of the greater exploration into these areas and allowed for more kind of exotic specimens to start being imported. So Collinson's idea coincided with this era, and it suddenly became a craze to kind of have these plants and to show off. It almost became a competition to see kind of who had the best and most like the rarest plant to have on offer. And soon you had stately homes such as Goodwood, Blenheim Palace, Charlton House, all buying into this kind of subscription box for plants. And they took inspiration as well from them, so would seek out their own kind of influences as well and see who could have the best display or who had the most exciting garden. So it's at this point that we kind of see the gardening culture of Britain really transform into something that was new and sort of not seen before. It's more of an art form rather than a practice. And it was, as I mentioned before, this explosion of colour. So you had people competing to have the sort of most beautiful garden. And this continued well into the 19th century as the age of empire continued to prevail, and started a craze that lasted well after Collinson and Bartram had died. So this kind of, it's at this point that you kind of see two sides to their relationship. On the one hand, you have these genuine friends who did enjoy working with each other and supporting each other and had a mutually beneficial relationship. Collinson was able to achieve his goal of creating a plant exchange and financially and socially profit from it. And Bartram was able to profit financially and was finally able to demonstrate his ability as an academic. So Collinson debuted his work in front of the Royal Society and had some of his work privately published as well, and did a lot of legwork when it came to Bartram becoming a noticeable and formidable name in the European intellectual community, something that was often quite a struggle for those outside of that culture and that sort of circle. But conversely, Collinson, as much as he did amazing work, was not always fully supportive of Bartram going down, especially when it came to Bartram going down his own lines of inquiry, and was not always supportive of Bartram proposing his own kind of answer to the Royal Society, and was content with keeping Bartram to do a lot of the dirty work for him, quite literally, and by going out on expeditions to retrieving specimens, and then was later content to kind of claim a lot of the credit and a lot of the rewards for himself, in the sense that he was able to claim that it was his actions that resulted in the acquisition of this new plant species, or it was his actions that brought this new species into Britain. And it's very, through this you can see how there was this disparity between the two worlds of the old world, with the European Enlightenment and the Royal Society being these quite astute, old-fashioned, for want of a better word, institutions, compared to the emerging institutions that we had in America, growing and flourishing in America. The Royal Society, compared to their American colleagues, did not regard them as equals. They wouldn't even have used the word colleagues, and they didn't see them as intellectual equals. The Royal Society enjoyed the luxury of this academic legitimacy. They didn't have to prove anything to anyone in terms of their ability to conduct these experiments or ponder deep philosophical questions. Whereas for the Americans, this was something they almost had to fight for. It was a struggle to be recognized, and were at a disadvantage financially. There wasn't as much interest in sponsorship compared to European ventures. Geographically, not only were they thousands of miles away from the nearest kind of established institution of learning, they were thousands of miles away from any of their colleagues. So a lot of the experiments that were being conducted in Europe at the time that were groundbreaking and really kind of changing the way in which people thought about the world around them, it was all of it was happening quite quickly, and it was hard to keep up with the kind of the speed of correspondence at the time for even Europeans. So imagine having this massive distance between you, and you're trying to keep up with these ongoing experiments and the rapid kind of advancement of thought while you're thousands of miles away from anything. And also just they were generally at a disadvantage due to just the general prejudice against them that was there seemingly at all times. They were always put down and always kind of not recognized for who they were or what they could do. It was always, if an American can do it, a European can do it better, kind of thing. But this was about to change, and strangely enough, it was Collinson who, despite discouraging Bartram and not putting him down, but not wanting him to rise above his station, that had a not too insignificant role in bringing about a new age for American intellectualism, and how the American intellectual culture as a whole was regarded on a European and an international scale. So it's at this point that Franklin is introduced into the picture, and the two worlds begin to kind of overlap. And we see the evolving world of the old world of Europe and the new world begin to fully kind of encroach on each other's territories. So the origins of their friendship, now seemingly very kind of different people. Collinson and Franklin were quite alike in the sense that where Collinson had his ambition to create a transatlantic exchange of botanical specimens and subsequent network of scientific exchange between intellectuals, both European and American, Franklin had his own personal ambition to improve the overall culture and the overall intellectual culture of the American colonies. Each man had their own network of correspondence that they'd procured by the time that they were introduced to each other, that was expanding but not quite reaching the limits of the potential that they had in mind. Franklin, on his behalf, had made great strides in the world of printing, and he had printing shops and printing apprentices kind of littered up and down the colonies. And Collinson, at this point in their friendship, was still an up and coming, but still a very much established and respected merchant and hobby botanist. And at this point as well was a member of the Royal Society with his lengthy list of notable academics at his disposal. And it was unbeknownst to them, but each man could essentially offer the other almost exactly what the other one needed to kind of achieve their mutual aims. So the Library Company of Philadelphia is how the two really came to kind of intersect with each other. And now for the Library Company of Philadelphia, we have to go back to the sort of origins of Franklin's intellectual career, with the formation of the Junto in 1727, which was Franklin's Discussion and Mutual Improvement Society, and kind of modelled off the Royal Society in a sense of it was a conglomerate of men that would meet regularly to kind of discuss progressing ideas in philosophy, science, history, anything and everything essentially. But it was also a mutual improvement society, so each man would bring their own expertise to the table. Franklin, as a printer, could print the works of his colleague who may have been a botanist, for example, or if one of his close friends was conducting experiments and wanted to publish his findings, Franklin would very happily do that. And in the same respect, these other men would give Franklin the benefits of their own career, because at this stage they were all artisanals. They weren't learned men, they weren't like politicians, they weren't diplomats, they were what was called leather apron men, so men of the craft, and were very humble and just had a great respect for kind of useful thinking and practical applications of knowledge. So the Library Company comes about as an offshoot of this group. It was the first lending library of the colonies, and founded in 1731, was undoubtedly groundbreaking for its time. The first publicly available book lending service offered all kinds of books, from historical texts, science, philosophy, anything and everything, and encouraged people to read and improve their own knowledge. Collinson was headhunted as the London agent and book buyer for this library company, and it was through the organisation that the two became acquainted. They soon realised that they had this mutual ambition and aims that were very well suited to each other and overlapped quite well, and they lent each other their expertise and began, like Collinson had begun with Franklin, a friendship that lasted until Collinson's death in 1768. But the differences in Collinson's relationship with Franklin compared to his relationship with Bartram, as I will discuss in a second. So it could appear that Collinson saw Franklin as more of a colleague. He perhaps respected him more intellectually than he did Bartram. And Collinson may have even thought that Franklin didn't have anything to prove to him in the same way that Bartram did, Now, was this because of his background? So it was like printer versus farmer. Was it a more respected career in Collinson's eyes? Franklin was arguably more successful and accomplished. His career as a printer was phenomenally celebrated, and was more gentlemanly when compared to Bartram, despite the fact that Benjamin Franklin still maintained this leather apron man persona and remained humble throughout his pretty much his entire life. So it's unclear, and you can argue both sides as to sort of why the relationship was so different despite the men being so similar, but it does provoke greater intrigue into how the Collinson-Franklin relationship really kind of functioned. So we've already established that Collinson was a merchant botanist and acted as the agent for the library company, but one of the perhaps greatest actions, and something he probably didn't even think too much of at the time, and probably saw as quite inconsequential, ended up being one of his greatest successes. So more than a book buyer, Collinson was undoubtedly the cause of Franklin's interest in electrical experimentation, and anyone can tell you that Franklin is synonymous with this image of him and the key and the kite, and I would say it's Collinson that we kind of have to thank for that. Franklin had expressed an interest in electrical experimentation after watching travelling shows that used kind of minor electrical current experiments as entertainment. And then Collinson, in a 1745 shipment to the library company, sent Franklin the experimentation equipment and a manuscript of experiments that had been conducted in Europe, and shipped this to Franklin for kind of just for his interest as part of a shipment sent to the library company. And that was it. Essentially, Franklin was captivated. Him and other members of the library company worked tirelessly recreating these experiments and conducting many of their own. And over the course of 1747 to 1748, Franklin wrote to Collinson letters about his experiments, and went into immense detail and left him with essentially a step-by-step guide on these experiments, what they did, how they did it, and also offered a unique and more kind of perceptive analysis of his thoughts compared to those made by the original conductors of the experiments. So Collinson was thrilled when he received these letters from Franklin. He noticed and was able to pick up on how groundbreaking they were, and recognize the kind of importance that these could and would later have in the intellectual kind of world of both the European Enlightenment and the American Enlightenment. So passed them on to the Royal Society, and also had them independently published. And it's from there that it became a sensation. The Royal Society finally began taking notice of the work Franklin and his colleagues did for the first time. And it was also at this time as well that the European community began to take true notice of it. So the experiments were published in French, and he became something of a celebrity, really. And this is where Franklin really earns his fame. Now, he later wrote another letter in 1752 detailing another experiment. And if there was any doubt as to Franklin's degree of fame before this, it was certainly gone after this experiment was published. It won him the Copley Medal in 1753 and earned him finally his Royal Society membership in 1756. So what was this experiment, you may ask? It was the infamous key and the kite experiment that kind of mythologized Franklin and has essentially immortalized Franklin's image in international history. And Collinson, as a result of this fame, was immensely supportive of Franklin, was with him and backed him through kind of every step of the way along this kind of experimental journey that he had. He wasn't really critical, where he had dissuaded Bartram from initiating an American response to the Royal Society. He almost encouraged Franklin to do the same, and eventually was quite key in facilitating the kind of joint work of Franklin and Bartram to begin the American Philosophical Society, which did end up being the kind of American answer to the Royal Society after its relatively rocky start. Now, Collinson didn't put Bartram at a disadvantage, but he also wasn't afraid to put him down and critique his work where he wasn't willing to do the same to Franklin. So was Collinson just aware he was out of his area of expertise in this sense? So wasn't comfortable in critiquing the work of an electrician compared to his stance as a botanist? Or did he just have a different understanding of the relationship he had with these two men? So did he see more of Franklin as more of a colleague? And did he see more of see Bartram as more of like a mentee in the same way that James Logan had kind of taken him under his wing? But what was certain was that Collinson had inadvertently catapulted Franklin to this degree of international fame and renown, which was a ladder that he only continued to climb as time went on. By sending the Leyden jar, Collinson had essentially opened up a whole new world for Franklin and exposed him to new people, new social circles, and new ways of thinking that he would be undoubtedly immensely grateful for later on in life. And it's at this point that Collinson, you can kind of see that he's really firmly established a consistent and a working transatlantic network of scientific correspondence for himself with the aid of Franklin. And most importantly, whether or not he intended to do this originally, he had proven the intellectual capability of the Americans to a skeptical and somewhat snobbish Royal Society, and furnished them with the confidence and the ability to create their own networks that would prove immensely valuable when it came down to the American Revolution. So we do need to kind of take a step back at this point and place these men that we've looked at so far in the context of the world around them and in the context of the events that were unfolding as they were realizing their own personal ambitions, and understand that this kind of snippet and this snapshot of these men's lives was just one small cog in something much bigger and part of something much more that went far beyond anything even related to them. So I've mentioned the American Enlightenment and I've mentioned the European Enlightenment. The European Enlightenment, first of all, was the older of the two movements. Collinson and Franklin contextually were both operating in this field. It was, and the American Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment itself was something that dominated the 18th century. It was an intellectual movement that heavily centered around scientific discovery and celebrated the use of reason and rational thought to understand the world around everyone and around us, rather than accept the word of the church or the state as this definitive doctrine. Individuals were starting to look outside of their own confines and borders to connect with others on a kind of intellectual basis. And it was this culture of enlightenment and this way of life that was teeming out of the London coffee shops that Franklin went to when he went over to Britain for the first time in 1724. So he came back enamored with this culture and this way of life, and found in himself this desire to kind of recreate its institutions for an American public. And on his return, he brought the Enlightenment with him, and was probably one of the only people with the kind of the energy and the character and the drive to really kind of accomplish this ambition. And it was with this ambition that he created institutions, as I've mentioned, like the Junto, the Library Company, the American Philosophical Society, and properly provided individuals with and like-minded individuals with the means to kind of expand their own knowledge and their own ambition. Now, the American Enlightenment kind of took place alongside was the kind of justification behind the American Revolution that was kind of on the horizon. So it's happening in the background and behind the scenes and setting up for something a bit bigger. So it's very easy to kind of see the American Revolution as quite black and white. So one minute everything was kind of seemingly okay, and the next minute it was all kind of descending into this chaos, as though the opposition to Britain had kind of come out of nowhere, really. And you do have the side of the revolution that is very physical. You see it in the violence that kind of crops up in like 1770 with the Boston Massacre, or 1773 with the Tea Party. And these were reactionary events that occur very much as a spur of the moment thing or in a burst of emotion. But or as like a manifestation of this anger that people were feeling as a result to the mismanagement of the British government. But without trying to undermine the importance of these events, they only represent half of the picture, essentially. When it comes to understanding the revolution, you have to understand that the revolution is a culmination of something much bigger, something much wider and broader. And the American Enlightenment is the argument that kind of bolsters everything up, and it predates any of the action that kicks off in the latter half of the 18th century. The institutions produced by the Enlightenment, so namely the ones that I discussed, are perhaps the most important. They still stand today, and these institutions, outside of their main purpose, serve to prove to a somewhat kind of snobbish international community of intellectuals that America was more capable of equaling or even rivaling them in terms of their capability for academic achievement. But most importantly, it was in these institutions that American intellectuals and the general American public was able to rationalize their own thoughts in the same way that the Europeans had done years prior, and kind of position themselves in this world around them and identify themselves as this nation of people independent in their identity to their overseas rulers. And the networks of correspondence that were built and maintained by those who forged the friendships and allegiances through science were later overtaken by those whose agendas transitioned from the philosophical and from the scientific to the political, with Franklin being one of the most notable examples of this. So it was often the intellectuals themselves that were leading and at the forefront of the debates around the British rights to rule and the arguments of taxation without representation. And it was later, when Franklin came back to London in 1757 as a diplomat and stayed at Craven Street, that he was able to deploy and utilize these friendships that he had forged through his scientific career and the subsequent sort of celebrity status that he achieved as a result of Collinson's direct involvement. And as we know, Franklin wasn't successful in brokering the peace, but what he did kind of unknowingly succeed in was laying these foundations for the American Enlightenment and in facilitating the beginning of the American Revolution. So, to excuse the pun, the seeds of the revolution was planted by the botanists, the physicians, the astronomers, the experimenters, and the philosophers who laid the foundation of this intellectual culture and ushered in a new age of thinking that, despite taking its influence from its European counterpart, was so unique in its makeup and in its culture that it created an American identity and paved the way towards the American Revolution. So just to kind of wrap everything up quite nicely, I'm going to return to Collinson, do a full circle. I'm going to talk about and summarize on his legacy that still does pertain to this day. So Mill Hill, that I mentioned, was his residence for a large portion of his life, and it still does stand today. It's a school, but they do have a legacy garden, and in the legacy garden it contains a lot of the same plants that Collinson would have had during his time living in there, and as well as many others that he had a hand in kind of bringing over in naming and classifying. But as a school and as an institution, I personally think that they've done great work in kind of maintaining this legacy and providing information in a way that's enjoyable for all. I think everyone loves a garden. It's really beautiful, and it's accessible to everyone, really. So it's available for anyone to kind of enjoy, and there's a lot of resources available online as well that they've produced to kind of honour his legacy. And as previously mentioned as well, he is survived by his plants that he brought over and helped to name, classify and kind of catalogue. And this legacy lasts in perpetuity and is one that is also enjoyable, because why not plant one in your garden? And just to kind of bring everything to a nice, neat close, I'd just like to highlight kind of how important Collinson was as a figure and how influential he was, particularly in the often selfless work that he did for others. And personally, I think he's someone that is quite often overlooked in narrative of history. So yeah, thank you for all your time and for listening to me kind of ramble on about plants. And I hope you enjoyed. If any,
Thank you, Alice. That was amazing. Thank you so much. That was yeah, fascinating. Yeah, more people should definitely know about Peter Collinson. He
I think so.
is such a great man. So yeah, thank you for doing your bit to enter me into history books. We've just got about 5 minutes for questions. So if anyone does have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box as soon as you can. We have got 3 just come in, so I'll just quickly run through those. First of all, someone wants to know where Mill Hill is. So that is a very good question.
I think it's northwest London, as far as like my memory serves me correct.
Yeah, it's northwest, kind of bordering towards Hertfordshire way. So yeah, definitely do take a trip to Mill Hill if you get a chance, because yeah, it's always great to see these people's houses. So we have a question. Someone said, "This is tremendous, Alice." So great job. But they've asked, do we know who among the British aristocracy Collinson supplied with plants as they sought to compete to be the most fashionable, or are those records lost?
To my knowledge, I think there are, I mentioned a few like the kind of the stately homes. So I think it was like Goodwood, and the dukes that kind of resided in these homes. It's my understanding that they bought into the subscription boxes. I think Kew Gardens is also quite a good one to mention. I don't know if they directly bought into the subscription boxes or if they kind of just took the influence, but Collinson definitely did have a hand in kind of curating some of the gardens at Kew and also providing the influence behind this new gardening culture that was emerging. But I'd say I'm not 100% sure, I can't lie, but I definitely know that a few Goodwood is probably one of the most prominent examples of the aristocracy that like bought into this kind of fashion that was emerging.
Great. Yes, I think that answers it very well. So someone has also asked, well, they've said, thank you for a delightful presentation to begin with. So
Thank you.
They have asked that they first learnt of Collinson about a month ago through Andrea Wolf's Brother Gardeners. What other books or resources might you recommend that they read to learn about Collinson next?
There's quite a few available through the British Library. I'm trying to remember the exact names. Oh God. I think any kind of account on Franklin does go into some detail on Collinson. There is a very good book written by someone called I think his name is Jonathan Lyons, called the Society for Promotion of Useful Knowledge or something to that effect, and it goes into how Benjamin Franklin and the Friends kind of kickstarted the European Enlightenment. That book goes quite a lot into detail, especially with Bartram. It does touch on Collinson as well in the sense of like the relationship between the two of them, and it does go into a lot of detail about like this network of correspondence that was emerging in the scientific community. So that would be a good one to do. The British Library has quite a lot on Collinson. There's a few books available through there. A lot of it's online. I think Mill Hill, as I mentioned, has quite a few good ones. In the sense of they've like catalogued quite a lot of his plants. They've got summaries of his life. I mean, unfortunately, there's not a great deal out there in terms of, in the sense where Benjamin Franklin kind of, if he sneezed, it's documented. Like the biographies of his life are in abundance and his life is so well documented. I think it's a shame that Collinson isn't in the same sense. But I think definitely through the British Library there's a few. There's a book called Forget Not Me or My Garden, which is a book of his correspondence, and it's not just limited to Bartram or Franklin. It's like a compilation of his correspondence with a lot of his contemporaries, and that's quite good in the sense of it's an insight into how he spoke to these people and what he was talking about and the relationships that he was able to forge. Yeah, I'd say it's a good place to start.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure that will keep you going for some time. Someone's asked, can you remind me of the key in the kite experiment? Do you want to answer that? Or yeah.
Oh god, that one. I can't remember the ins and outs of it.
Do you want me to take it, seeing it's Benjamin? Yeah. So it was just an experiment that Benjamin Franklin did in the 1750s in Philadelphia. He basically took a kite out during a storm, and there was a key attached to a string, and from that he could draw an electrical charge from the sky when lightning struck, basically, and from that he could prove that lightning itself was a source of electricity, thereby going on to invent the lightning conductor. It's probably like one of his most famous experiments, but there is some discourse suggesting he might not have ever performed the experiment himself, just because obviously it is highly dangerous, but he definitely documented the kind of method of doing so, and obviously was very influential in the discovery of that. So yeah, that's just a quick sum up of the and then just a last question. Perhaps Collinson's relationship with Bartram was tainted by commerce and his relationship with Franklin was not. That would explain the gentlemanly difference in status. And they want to know, have you considered that before?
Yeah, I would say, I think that's a very good way of looking at it, actually, and quite a nice sort of summary of put it better than I explained it. I think the relationship with that Collinson had with Franklin was probably more genuine, in the sense that they had a shared a sort of interest in similar things, and it, like you said, it wasn't tainted by this like this financial sort of impetus that was like driving behind it. It was more of just a kind of gentlemanly discussion between friends, whereas with Bartram, I think Collinson definitely did kind of see a way to kind of exploit the relationship, in a sense, and kind of seek out financial gain. He may have respected him in that sense, and he definitely did respect him to a degree, but definitely not to the same degree as he respected Franklin. So I think yeah, I completely agree.
Great. We are going to wrap up now. Sorry if anyone did have any more questions, but you can always get in touch with us at info@benjaminfranklinhouse.org. I'll repeat that. That's info@benjaminfranklinhouse.org. And we will pass on your questions to Alice, who can then answer them if there's anything pressing that we didn't get around to. And as I say, the talk will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel as well in the next week or so. Sorry, Alice, did you have something you were going to?
I was just going to say, I could probably I'm so sorry, I'm quite nervous. So I could probably better answer. I mean, if anyone who did have a question wanted to email in, I'd be more than happy to kind of respond, particularly in relation to if you wanted like a bibliography kind of text about Collinson. If you were to email in, I'd happily kind of send you like a list. It's just spur of the moment. My mind's gone completely blank.
No, that'd be great. Thank you. Yeah, if you did want that bibliography, the person who asked that question, then please do get in touch with us and we'll be happy to supply that. Just before we end, I will quickly remind you all to take a quick look at our events page on the Benjamin Franklin House website, because we do have a few exciting things coming up, both in-house and virtually. So hopefully there will be something for everyone there. And of course, please do join us this weekend as we celebrate the coronation of King Charles III, just as Benjamin Franklin would have done himself for King George III in 1761. So yes, a very exciting weekend ahead. But for now, a massive thank you to Alice for this evening. It was, as I said, a fascinating talk, and I'm really pleased that Peter Collinson finally gets his kind of place in the world. What a lovely way to celebrate the National Gardening Week as well. But yes, thank you everyone for joining us. I do hope you enjoyed, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you. Goodbye.